DC Comics has been publishing Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman comics starting all the way back in the late 1930s, whereas Marvel Comics has a relevant continuity dating back to a paltry 1961. If you want some context around Superman and Batman's longevity, their creation predates World War II, the Cleveland Indians World Series drought, go Cubs, and television. As a result, DC Comics has a heck of a long publication history that can be a challenge for new readers to navigate. There is no one correct way to get started with DC Comics, and unfortunately, unlike TV series, there is no definitive episode 1. Comic books are spread across multiple series titles, for example, Action Comics, Detective Comics, World's Finest, etc., and offer traditionally non-linear narrative paths as a result. Nonetheless, here you'll find some approaches for getting started with DC Comics, particularly for new readers starting this year. Hey everybody, I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com, and this is where to start with DC Comics. If you like Comic Book Herald, please subscribe, like, share, comment, all that fun stuff. Helps the channel out a great deal. All of the reference material and guides mentioned here will be linked in the show notes, with links taking you to the world-famous comicbookherald.com. Approach number 1, start with the newest DC Comics. Having discussed all that massive history behind DC, the reality of superhero universes is you don't always have to crawl all the way back to the very beginning to catch up with the present. Sure, you can try to start with Superman's first appearance in Action Comics number 1, but that noble aim is going to very quickly turn into a miserable challenge, feeling far too similar to homework. Fortunately, comic book publishers are perpetually attempting to make their universe accessible to new readers to varying degrees of success, and 2021's Infinite Frontier and 2023's Dawn of the DCU are the latest examples in the DC catalog. To make a long story short, or shortish, from 2011 to mid-2016, DC ran a controversial and often reviled rebooted universe called the New 52, but in many ways beloved by new fans. In my book, the New 52 has plenty of highly enjoyable comics and is actually the most new reader-friendly major comics initiative of my life. We'll get to that in a second. The initiative, not my life. But nonetheless, it was a public relations train wreck by 2016. Enter DC Rebirth. DC finally ended the New 52 and brought back the history and legacy of their full continuity into all new number 1 issues across all their titles like Batman, Wonder Woman, and Justice League. DC Rebirth is designed as a logical starting place for new DC readers, and although it's more indebted to the New 52 than DC would like to admit, it's new reader friendly enough for most. To get started with DC Rebirth, you have a couple options. First, you could check out my full DC Rebirth universe reading order on CBH. This will tell you about every single comic in Rebirth and where you should read each story. So if you're not sure if you're more interested in Suicide Squad or Cyborg, or simply want to read them all, I highly recommend the Comic Book Herald Guide, again, linked in the show notes. In its later years, though, DC Rebirth ran into the same problems as the New 52. It's almost like history can teach us lessons. Nah. And the rise of Infinite Frontier promises a new era, off to an interesting start into 2023. For new readers, the Dark Crisis event leads into Dawn of the DCU and is the clearest on-ramp if you just want to catch up to the publisher's current state of affairs. I would argue, though, if you're a brand new reader, Dark Crisis is a weird place to start. The reality of modern DC is a series of escalating crises, events, and era reboots, and honestly, I've found it pretty disappointing lately. For my money, if you're brand new, I think you're best off trying out the New 52 or DC Rebirth as jumping on points into modern DC. Again, complete CBH guides in the show notes. Approach number 2, you could take a curated fast-track approach through the best of the publisher's history. Now, if you want to go back beyond the New 52 and start with DC Comics from earlier in the 2000s, there's a solid, clear, essential fast-track guide on CBH that'll take you through all the must-reads. The fast-track will take you through instant classic storylines like Identity Crisis, Batman Under the Red Hood, and Flashpoint that are still frequently referenced in fandom and DC Comics today. Now, whereas Marvel kind of soft reboots with 1998's Marvel Knights and post-Heroes Return era, DC's clearest line in the sand, jumping on point, actually goes all the way back to 1985's Crisis on Infinite Earths. You effectively have classic DC before Crisis and the modern era capturing virtually everything after. So yes, of course, CBH has curated guides for all eras, again in the show notes, but for now, I'll share some key jumping on points that will get you rolling. Number 1, the Golden Age. DC's golden age of comics from the late 1930s into the early 50s marked the beginning of the superhero genre and established DC Comics as one of the leading publishers of comic books in the world. If you're a fan of superheroes and or comic book history, exploring the golden age of DC Comics is a really fun place to start, with the introductions of Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and other golden age standouts such as Plastic Man or Captain Marvel, although these famously weren't published under DC, then National, comics at the time. Listen, these are going to read like they're old, and guess what? They are. But again, if you're a fan of that history and you really, really are desperate to start at the true beginning, the Golden Age can be a pretty good time. Number 2, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams' Batman. Writer Denny O'Neil and artist Neil Adams collaborated on the Batman comic book series in the late 1960s and early 1970s. O'Neil and Adams took the character in a darker and more realistic direction, emphasizing the dark and brooding aspects of the character and exploring complex social and political issues. Some of the most notable stories from this era include The Joker's Five-Way Revenge and The Secret of the Waiting Graves, both of which are really good ones to just hop in on to get a feel for what this era of Batman is like. This run really transforms Batman from 66 Dayglow pop to the Dark Knight we recognize today, and is hugely influential, I think, in terms of the modern recontextualization of what DC Comics can be. Number 3, jump right after Crisis on Infinite Earths. The aftermath of 1985's Crisis on Infinite Earths by Marv Wolfman and George Perez reset the DC universe to one core universe, and a chance to redefine the official origins and early days of its most iconic characters. This resulted in a variety of the publisher's most memorable work, including John Byrne's Man of Steel, Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's Batman Year One, and George Perez's Wonder Woman, among many, many others. Number 4, jump ahead to 1997, Grant Morrison and Howard Porter on JLA. This was a time when the Justice League of America was given a much-needed shot in the arm, and man, did it deliver. What really made this run special was the sense of grandeur that Morrison and Porter brought to the table. This was a Justice League for the ages, a team of heroes who were truly greater than the sum of their parts. They weren't just fighting street-level criminals, they were taking on gods and monsters and saving the multiverse itself. For my money, this is kind of the modern restarting of DC Comics. If you're going to look at 98's Marvel Knights for Marvel, for me, it's 97 JLA with Morrison and Porter for DC. Number 5, Identity Crisis. At its core, Identity Crisis by Brad Meltzer and Rags Morales is a story about a terrible tragedy that strikes the Justice League, one that shakes the very foundation of their partnership. The story forces the heroes to confront the darkest aspects of their own natures and to ask whether the ends always justify the means. More so, it kickstarts the DC era of events, setting the stage for the ensuing Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, and much more. Note that despite its continuity relevance, the work is quite controversial for its poor treatment of women and sexual assault. That will take you up to the 2000s, where the next clear jumping on point is Flashpoint and 2011's aforementioned New 52. Your third option here, the best DC comics of all time. Similar to the previous approach, but for many DC fans, the best possible starting place is simply to jump in to the greatest hits. Now, obviously, over the course of over 80 years of publishing, DC has released some of the best superhero comics of all time, and in some cases, they can claim just straight up some of the absolute best comics of all time. If you want to see the full list of my favorite comics of all time and where these DC books compare, you can view the best comics of all time on CBH. And of course, if there's enough interest, I could even be persuaded to do a video. Don't worry, I'm already making this video, but it can't hurt to hear some interest in the comments. Otherwise, I've listed out my 15 favorites here for easy perusing, excluding Watchmen and Sandman, which I have ranked as my first and second favorite comics of all time, even though they are debatably a part of the DC universe proper at this point. I honestly don't think you need a lot of background for most of these, as they work quite well as standalone comics. Dive right in and have a good time with Batman The Dark Knight Returns, Doom Patrol by Grant Morrison and Richard Case, Mr. Miracle by Tom King and Mitch Gerads, Starman, All-Star Superman, Gotham Central, Batman Year One, Batman The Long Halloween and Dark Victory, Saga of the Swamp Thing, Batman in the New 52, The Legion of Superheroes, The Great Darkness Saga, Hitman, Superman Smashes the Klan, JLA by Grant Morrison and Howard Porter, and Jack Kirby's Fourth World Saga. Final thoughts. Where can you find DC Comics? Well, the best option, as always, ongoing print comics. You can check out your local comic book shop. if you have access to one. For digital, DC does have a growing array of options, including DC Universe, which, is improving quite a bit. They had a lot of catching up to do to Marvel Unlimited, but they now have a decent-sized catalog and library for at least a competitive rate. Now that it includes an enormous amount of DC's publication history, it's your best bet for digital DC. Other options, though, would include like Hoopla. A particularly great option for new fans is all you need is a library card to enjoy free DC comics. And of course, you can read more about Hoopla Digital for comics on CBH. But there you have it. There's a path to starting with DC Comics this year, to diving into the giant history of this publisher. And of course, everything that I mentioned here is linked in the show notes if you want to dive in more detail over on comicbookherald.com. So let me know. What thoughts do you have? What questions do you have about starting with DC? I'm happy to check them out in the comments here. Otherwise, thanks for listening. I'm Dave, and you can find all my stuff on comicbookherald.com. Support for this show and for CBH in general is on patreon.com/comicbookherald. You can back us there and get some cool bonuses. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the comics.